Ideally speaking, what the cities practice is supposed to be the same thing that also informs the relations between economic superiors and their underlings in other parts of the economy in the countryside. In practice, it is a whole lot less equal, and there is a whole lot less mutual cooperation and respect between the lord of the manor and the peasants, who in some cases are still serfs, meaning that they're not free to pick up and leave. They're not property, they're not slaves, but rather they are considered bound to the soil. Now, this idea of being bound to the soil, of belonging to the land, and thereby belonging to the person in charge of the land, who is the noble, the lord, however, also limits the caprice of the lord. He can't do whatever he wants. One thing he can't do, and this is highly significant for showing the difference between this traditional order and the capitalist marketplace, is to sell the land or to subdivide it. He holds it, the ideal is, in trust for the king. And the people who live there, and the mills and the streams and forests and so forth, ultimately belong to the king, or rather, through the king, to God. The noble has just been put in charge of making the best out of it for the common good and for the benefit and welfare of everybody who lives there. In practice, in rural areas, the lords have usually managed to take more than what one might consider their fair share from the farmers or from the peasants or the serfs. In theory, on the other hand, and in legal fact, they are not free to do whatever they want. And one of the most important things is they can't just cash in and leave. They are just as bound to that soil as part of their family patrimony as are their serfs. So nobody really is fully free. Everybody exists in a hierarchical scaffolding where you are propping up those above you and where you're also supporting those below you. And that's the idea that informs Winthrop's ideal of harmony between different classes of people with different degrees of power. Now, the nobles, in turn, much like the journeymen are part of the household of the master of the craft, are considered to be members of the household of the king. If you remember the legend of King Arthur, where the kings sit around a round table with their king, which signifies a degree of equality, that the king is first among equals, a primus inter pares, suggests that this is the origin of the nobility. You are first considered part of the king's household, of the court, and then you go out into the provinces to take care of business. So the king and the nobles relate to each other in that same way. And the Pope, especially before the Protestant Reformation, is just the ultimate father figure in this hierarchical system. He then is the person who is above all the kings. The kings are part of God's household as administered by the Pope. And as you might have guessed, ultimately the father figure at the top of that whole hierarchical pyramid of mutually beneficial obligations is God. And for that reason, the laws and the rules God establishes, the values, the virtues that God lays out there, are what is supposed to go through all the levels of the hierarchy. No decision must be made that is not justifiable directly by furthering the will and the glory of God. So capitalism is significantly different from this. The economy is not considered to be tasked with ensuring morality. For Adam Smith, the moral philosopher who is considered the father of capitalism, who laid out the basic tenets of capitalism in his book, The Wealth of Nations, which he published in 1776, the same year that the American Revolution took place, says if you really want to do good, allow people to practice and to follow their self-interest. Throughout all times, moral philosophers, theologians, priests, etc. have said self-interest is of the devil, and it is the entryway to all sin, which is precisely what Winthrop is arguing. Every sin starts with self-interest and not considering others. Adam Smith, on the other hand, says if economically speaking everybody gets to do their own thing, they will do best, they will create more wealth, and it will mean that society at large is better off than if everybody tried to do good. It's a bit of a sneaky argument because the question is at what point do the people who accumulate the wealth start doing the good? But that's the principle. There is also the assumption that people are not obliged, not obligated to one another. You are free to leave your job. You are free to fire the person who is doing a job for you. You don't have to stick with your craft workshop or with your piece of land. You can sell that and move on to do something entirely different, become a stockbroker or a hedge fund manager. So the freedom in this system of capitalism, of course, also applies to the lower sorts, to the working class. They are free laborers. They are not bound to the workshop of the master. They are not bound to the soil of the lord's manor. On the other hand, they are also free from the ability to make a living without hiring for wages with somebody. They're not taken care of by default, but rather they are in need of employment. What you notice when you compare these two systems, they are diametrically opposed. They are essentially polar opposites. Yet this is clearly part of a social development within Europe that happened over the course of 250 years, where our modern capitalist economy developed out of that traditional old order. So how did that happen? How is a process of such radical change conceivable in such a short period of time? There were a couple of revolutionary and otherwise earth-shaking events that made that possible. First, the discovery and exploitation of America. We'll go into more detail when we discuss slavery and this plantation system set up in the New World. The discovery of America created a whole lot of wealth for the merchant class of Europe that then was looking for an outlet of that wealth, for investment opportunity that they didn't have in a system where the guilds dominated all production in society. And what merchants wanted to do with that capital, with that wealth they accumulated from the exploitation of the Americas, was often to apply the lessons learned about labor management relations from the slave plantation to the relations between employers and workers in Europe. So the slave plantation became the prototype of the factory. How do you organize a workplace based on nothing but the assumption of profitability and efficiency? In distinction again to the craft workshop, where the idea is you collaborate, you work together for the greater good, and the person who owns the place works alongside everybody else. The owner of the plantation, on the other hand, never shows up. He usually lives in London or in Liverpool or on a country estate and has managers, overseers in charge of his plantation. So this is one thing. The other thing, the political aspect, is the revolutions in the United States in 1776 and in France in 1789. They got rid of all these old laws that codified the customs, which were the groundwork of the moral economy. So if you get rid of your king, you do make a whole lot of gains in terms of self-government. You can suddenly write your own laws, and none of the laws the king has made have any more power over you. But a big chunk of the laws that kings had made or had confirmed based on the lawmaking of lower level bodies had to do precisely with upholding and enforcing this moral economy. So for working people, the revolutions in the United States and France meant, in part, the loss of many of the protections against over-exploitation that they had previously enjoyed. And these were, of course, both the discovery and exploitation of the Americas and these political revolutions were radical novelties. Nonetheless, capitalism did not come into being overnight. Rather, the slow process was accelerated. And you could even argue that in the case of these political revolutions, it just kind of sealed the deal of a process that was already very much rolling on its own. Largely, however, the whole process really between the 1600 and 1850, or even between 1492 and the end of this class, 1877, is precisely the history of that transition from a traditional order to a capitalist society. So what we're doing in this class is, in fact, we're right in the middle of this process. And so for that reason, it's important to look at somebody who is so clear-sighted, almost prophetic, in his discussion of the problems of an economy that is based on self-interest and on the loss of the moral foundations that bind people to each other across class and occupational lines and so forth. So there was no capitalism yet as we know it when John Winthrop was giving his sermon on board the Arbella. But enough of the beginnings of it, the attitudes, the institutions that were dissolving the traditional order were clearly visible to be able to say that Winthrop was sermonizing as an anti-capitalist. He was developing the Christian argument against an economy that is based on self-interest. And this was so important to him that it warranted removal from Europe to go to the United States, to go to America, start from scratch, rebuild society along the rules of moral economy that had governed Europe, but that were being disregarded increasingly on this continent that was not just going through economic change, but that was also divided by religious conflict. So Winthrop takes off in 1630 when the 30 Years' War is 12 years old. And it's already pretty bad at that point. You might remember the map that showed the whole broad areas of Central Europe virtually depopulated by fighting and disease. And the way in which this need, this deprivation of war, affected people's willingness to think of others can't be overstated. The selfishness, to steal the boots of a dying person on a battlefield, that image that people have of the 30 Years' War, that increasingly governed how people behaved. So for Winthrop as a Christian, that is a problem. And it happens to resonate with that bigger process, with that larger long-term process that is going on. And for that reason, we are looking at Winthrop as somebody who is a critic of capitalism in a prophetic way, in a clear-sighted way, because he sees things that are coming that may not yet be fully visible to everybody. Now, the second part of this lecture is about the ways in which the Puritans, Winthrop's religious group, were path makers for capitalism. And this is where we will discuss Max Weber, and that will be the subject of part 2 of this lecture.